So, Great Inca Rebellion, as I said, this hopefully bridges us between what we saw or what we read about in chapter 3 on the conquest. So lots of conquest scenes. As I said, if you ever have to write a paper, don't do it like this film, right? You actually want to state your thesis at the very beginning of the paper, not wait until the end of it. So if you just watch the first part of the film, you'd be like, yeah, guns, germs, steel, that's how they did it. But it turns out it was these native allies. What really happened? I'm not sure how many times they said what really happened, but they finally got to it. We find out what really happened, which is the importance of perhaps not the most politically correct way to say it, but in the words of that historian, Indians fighting Indians. So this is a kind of a very different historiography and a very different ideas than some of the things that we've been taught about how the conquest went down, how colonialism went down, and a similar thing with independence and nation building. So let's start talking about the independence and nation building. I want to start out with a kind of curious question to you, which I'm not going to actually ask you to answer, but you might think about it a little bit. What are you willing to die for? Like, what if you had to sacrifice your life? What you would be willing to do that for? Do you do it for your wallet? Usually you don't, right? You just hand over your wallet and say, let me walk away. What are you willing to die for? You might also think about this in a somewhat different idea, the same, or as the another side of it. What are you willing to kill for? What would you be willing to take someone else's life for? So think about that for a second. I'm going to suggest that for many of us, we probably would be willing to die for our families, right? That would be something that would seem, the people that are closest to us, most people believe that they would sacrifice their own life for their family. In earlier times, and perhaps in much of today's world, people feel that they would sacrifice their life for their religion because, you know, in certain theological instances, if you're going to be damned to hell, you probably would rather sacrifice your life on earth for that instance or that belief. Now, I think that, you know, sometimes when you watch some of these older films or read historical accounts, people seem to sacrifice their lives for their religious beliefs on things like, I don't know, transubstantiation, so sort of doctrinal differences within Christianity, things that probably today many of us would be like, well, I'm not going to die for that one. If you want to tell me it's the body and blood or not the body and blood, I might just go with whatever you say. I'm not going to sacrifice my life for religion. And then there's the idea of sacrificing your life for your country, for your nation. Now, this is something that a lot of people say and do, and for the last, I don't know, 100, 200 years, a lot of people have sacrificed their lives or killed for in the name of their country, which would have been a relatively unusual experience or an unusual idea 200 or 300 years ago. The idea that you would die for a country is kind of a more recent idea in human history, and kind of a peculiar idea if you think about it. You know, why would you kill somebody for your country? So I think, you know, that's kind of what we're talking about today, is how is it that these ideas about what you would die for and kill for, maybe it seems kind of natural to us to think about this in terms of our family, but maybe it seems natural to us in terms of our country, but how did that come to be? Why does country come to seem like, oh yeah, you're supposed to do that because your country is like your family, even though, I mean, I think for most of us would readily admit this is a very much more abstract idea of some sort of territory that we own And, you know, people are willing to do this to various degrees. I want to bring in a couple other things that you probably wouldn't sacrifice your life for. But we see in the text, in the chapter here, that some people over time have thought these were things that they would die for or kill for. An identification with a region, a town, the North, the South, right? This is something that probably doesn't seem like we trying to think if this rings any bells for us today. But I think for the most part, we would say, well, that doesn't seem right that you would die for your region. Would you die for your ethnic group? Now, you know, in a lot of different parts of the world, and certainly in different parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, people have, in fact, mobilized loyalty based on, and we'll talk about this, we're going to talk about race and ethnicity tomorrow, and we'll be talking about gender on Thursday, and we'll be talking about religion on Friday, so we'll talk about all these things kind of in a row. But the idea that your ethnic group would be something that you would die for or take someone's life for. Think about your social class, your identification as a member of an elite, or Karl Marx probably famously wanted people to identify with the working class, the proletariat, to the extent that they would engage in a revolutionary activity and sort of rise up against people and perhaps even sacrifice themselves for that. A lot of people would probably not be too excited about doing that today. Marxism's kind of fallen on hard times. But these are things that, you know, these are various identities that have come in and out of favor as things that people will make the ultimate sacrifice for. I think on Friday, I think one of you asked, you know, why do so many people die and kill in the name of religion? Would we be better off with religion without religion, right? And so, I mean, I guess I think I would ask the same thing about country. How many people, you know, have sacrificed their lives or sacrificed the lives of others in the name of country? Sometimes I wonder which idea has resulted in more death, the idea of religion or the idea of country. I think as of 100 years ago, probably religion was way up there. Probably country's been making a huge run at it in the last century or so. But, you know, I think these are sort of interesting ideas about what beyond your kind of family life, what beyond you would be willing to sacrifice yourself for, and what things we think of as, well, why would he do that? Or why would they do that person? Why would a person do that? I said I wasn't going to ask you this question because the last time I asked this, I asked the students what they'd be willing to kill for, and one of them said his dog. He wanted to kill for his dog. And I said, no, man, no, why would you do that? No, you don't kill anybody because of a dog. And then this other, John Wick, they like, all of a sudden the students all rebelled on me. They were like, what, you haven't seen John Wick? Look at what that happened. I was like, no, I never saw that. So now I actually have seen John Wick. My son made me see it. And I guess indeed, some terrible stuff can happen if you get your dog killed. But anyway, I guess if the dog is family, that's what happens. There you go. The dog was religion. All right. So today we're talking about nationhood, independence, and specifically nation building. I actually want to start out with, or continue with a relatively curious question, which is that anthropology in general, start out with a statement and ask it as a question. Anthropologists in general did not, for a long time, study nations or national identity. So if you remember in the first class, I showed you that this was the second edition of Santabria. And interestingly, in the first edition, there was no chapter specifically devoted to nations or nation building in Latin America, which was, I used to play a joke on students and I said, well, let's turn to the chapter on nations. And they'd flip through and there wasn't one. I mean, every so often, or he would talk in different sections about nationalism and about nations, but in terms of a specific chapter, it wasn't even there. So why is it that anthropologists have kind of ignored or not done this as much as sort of, historians, political economists, political scientists and economists have, who probably have overstudied nations? And I think this goes back to something that we talked about in the very beginning, that in general, anthropology was founded on the idea that they were studying non-state societies, places that didn't have state level or national organization. So small indigenous societies or villages. Oftentimes, the sort of first anthropological studies were trying to be done completely in places that were completely outside of state formation and nation building. We were trying to get away from all of those. And even someone like Sidney Mintz, who we talked about a couple times already, who is studying and those who started turning toward peasant societies, toward different kinds of modern societies, we're still studying people who were kind of in rural areas, maybe in small parts. It wasn't something that people were studying the capital city or the nation of, trying to get a sense of the nation and how it worked. And so for a long time, anthropologists seemed to almost completely ignore the nation. So that was part of what was going on. The other reason that I think anthropologists really didn't study nations, and this is what we're going to get into in a second, which is that we didn't see nations as a kind of thing that came naturally. And this goes back to the first question I asked you. I think most of us think that it's kind of natural to defend your family or your kin. And so anthropologists probably studied a lot about kinship, about family. That was seen as kind of a baseline issue. But nation is a relatively recent add-on to the human experience, you might say. And so the idea that all of us belong to a nation, that as a human being, part of your identity is being a citizen or having to belong to a nation. And especially that identity, that your primary loyalty is waving a national flag, is something that has probably only arisen in the last couple hundred years. There are some probably earlier events or earlier processes in which people got really attached to certain larger identities that are kind of like nations, but really the idea that everybody belongs to a country and that you should be in a country, and that if you're not in a country, you're kind of suspicious. That's something that really happened quite recently. One of the people who's theorized this the most, or sort of launched a whole genre of scholarship on nations, is a historian named Benedict Anderson, who talked about and kind of invented this, or I think basically invented this idea of the nation as an imagined community. So again, this goes back to what we're talking about. What are you willing to battle over? What are you willing to die for? So a lot of times people think of themselves as belonging to a family, or belonging to a community. And what's unique about that, or what's specific about that, is that you usually see the people who are in your family, and you see the people who are in your community, and you have day-to-day interactions with them. But if you think about a country or a nation, it's impossible to meet the people in my country. I'm never going to see them all. If I do meet them, oftentimes I don't even get along with them. But somehow I imagine myself to be part of this larger thing we're going to call a nation, that it's like an extension of my family or my community. That somehow I have something in common with people from California, way over there, right? And so this is what Santabria talks about, that elites, the people on top of the social pyramid, had to create this common sense of an imagined community, this common sense of nationhood, which would triumph over other divisions, racial divisions, cultural divisions, might add geographic divisions. Now, Santabria is being a little bit optimistic here, in that I'm not sure all the elites necessarily want to do this. And oftentimes they want to create one kind of imagined community, which is going to leave out different kinds of people that are in it. And they're trying to, I think almost every idea of a nation with an imagined community, almost all the time, is going to leave out or try or exclude certain people from the idea of the nation. But let's just give this the optimistic sense, or we'll give it the idealistic sense, that people are really trying. They are tasked with this idea of creating an inclusive imagined community. Now, one of the models for how to do this was probably actually, I think probably the French nation in some ways was seen as a model for this, even within Europe and some of the European countries that established a national government later. This is one of my favorite quotes about this process of how do you go from how do you make people feel like they are part of the same, or part of this larger world, so, or a larger country. Massimo, I'm not going to just be able to pronounce an Italian last name. Here's our politician in 1861 who was instrumental in unifying various little sort of kingdoms and principalities in what is now Italy. And he was able to unify them, or he was helped out, and create an independent national state government. And then what he said was very interesting. He said, "We have made Italy." And what he meant by that is, hey, we now have a unified government. We have a state. Now we must make Italians, which is to say, people didn't think of themselves as belonging to this thing called Italy. They might have thought of themselves as belonging to a specific language group, or a community, or a principality, or a church, but they didn't necessarily think of themselves as being part of this Italian community. So this is his quote here expresses a common fact about nations, is that for the most part, it is the state or the governing apparatus which comes before the creation of a national identity. And so this becomes the question, as some of these countries achieve independence from their colonial rule, how do we turn people who might have been allied, who might have thought of themselves as from Bogota and Medellin, or these different towns or different regions or different ethnic groups? And how do we turn them into people who think of themselves as Colombian or Mexican or Guatemalan or Chilean, right? How do we instill a national identity into people? What's a good way to do this, Lydia? What would you say? Good thing to do to make people feel like they're part of a nation. Give them the same food. Too soon. We're going to talk about that in a second. Let's go back a second before that. What are we doing now?
Probably trying to teach them the same story about who they are.
Trying to teach them the same story about who they are. Okay, so first you need, see, I had to go back another thing. There we go. There. We'll put all that up there, and then we'll talk through it. So how do you make people into citizens? First, I guess you have to have people who want to do this. Like I said, not everybody, not all of the elites even wanted to do this. And in some of the elites who maybe wanted to do this didn't have the resources to do it. So first is, you kind of need people in power who want to do this and then who have the resources to carry it out. Now, one of the best ways you can do this is by sending people to school. School, as Lydia has just told us, give people this sense of a shared history, that we all came from the same place, and you turn and you learn the history of your state, or you learn the history of your country, and you learn about the heroes of independence, and you learn about the government, and you get this sense that, hey, we're all in this together. The other thing that schools do, which is hugely important, this happened in France, it happened in Italy, it happened to various degrees in the Americas, although in some ways the Americas already had kind of the Catholics to do this for them in colonization, is you standardize the language so that you take people from different regions who might speak different dialects or speak in different accents, and you put them all and you make sure that everybody has a standard, one standard, not different standard, one standard for how you speak, how you write, how you quote things, all those things that your teachers always get hung up about. That's one of the reasons, because we want everybody to be having a shared sense of history. And it gives you literacy so that, we teach you how to read, how to write. And that's hugely important, because another enormous factor in creating the sense of nationhood. What else do they do, Lewis? What do they do with that literacy? What can you then do? Printing them, yeah. You get a printing press going, and you start churning out, things like newspapers. And Benedict Anderson talked about this, the idea that something would show up at your door, or you'd go out and buy it, and on one single page, you'd have kind of all the news that everyone would be reading. And you'd have this idea that people shared the same information about what was important, and kind of, you might have different opinions about that, but you would share this sense of the same facts. Now, I'll just say that you may have noticed in the last 10 years or so, the whole idea that for one thing, the newspaper circulation has gone way down. So the number of people who actually get a single sheet of paper, or whatever, how many sheets the newspaper was, and read it, has gone way down. And so now we can get our news in different forms. And so some people get their news from different cable networks. Most people usually get it off of social media, TikTok news. And so the idea that we have a shared set of facts, so it used to be we had, I don't know if this was ever completely true, but the idea was you had one set of facts and then you'd have different opinions about those facts. Now you can go get whatever facts you want. So you don't really have a different opinion about you have different facts and different opinions, or your facts are shaped more by your opinions. Anyway, the standard national idea, though, is that you have one shared set of facts that is put out in a newspaper. Now, this works, I would say, to varying degrees, or Santabria gives us a good example of compare and contrast what happened in Nicaragua versus what happened in Costa Rica. So in Costa Rica, the elite had a fairly unified idea that this is what they wanted to do. They got their school system together. They got their, they wanted to promote literacy. They wanted to create this sense of national identity. And to a large extent, they were relatively successful at doing this. In Nicaragua, it didn't work out the same way. There were some people who wanted to do this, but a lot of people really didn't want to do it. The schools were never, they didn't really get much universal schooling. The authors had various perspectives on things. A lot of them actually weren't even from Nicaragua. And so in some ways, the Nicaraguan experience, they didn't have much success at creating this sense of national shared identity. And it's something that, for anyone who looks at kind of the different trajectory of Costa Rica and Nicaragua, which are two, in some ways, very similar places in Central America, but have had very different histories of in some ways, you may know about Nicaragua from all the revolutions and guerrilla fighting. And we know about Costa Rica because that's where we like to go on ecotourism, and they got rid of their army a long time ago. And they have universal health care. So, it isn't necessarily that their social system was all that different, but this kind of idea that they should all share one thing was quite different in these two almost neighboring places. Some other ways that you build a nation. So I've talked about print media and schools. The other thing is simply by building roads, railways, trying to bring different parts of the country together. So interestingly, this is something that I looked at in the region where I was studying in Colombia in sort of the up until about the 1920s. They had a railroad, but it went from the sort of highlands out to the coast, and it was meant to export products out. It didn't really unite anybody inside the country. After the 1930s, Great Depression and sort of dampened the demand for exports, they started building all these railroads and roads that would unify and bring together the country, and that was the idea behind the infrastructure. So it's very interesting if you look at various countries in Latin America and the infrastructure that was built, you can often tell there's often countries that were completely oriented toward exporting and toward the outside world, and there's others that were able to kind of build their infrastructure so that it would unify their various regions. They used to say in the region where in Colombia where I worked, they used to say it would have been easier to get to London from there than it would be to get to Bogota, which was the capital, because you could get out and export things. And this was true of many Latin American countries as well. So yes, this is what Lydia was talking about before, which is the food. Louis, you also mentioned this, the cookbooks. So not just being able to print to print newspapers, but the idea that your cuisine was not just a regional cuisine, was not just something that your family was doing, but belonged to a national cuisine. So there's something called Mexican food. And it wasn't just the food from Puebla. It was, something from the north, something from the south. And it could be put into one book and then people could learn how to do it. And so this brings up an important point, which I've already talked about. Whenever you are thinking about a nation, you always have to ask, who is in, whose cuisine, whose cookbook, what kind of meals get included, and what gets excluded. Santabria gives a good example in terms of healthcare and different ideas about, well, who should have access to healthcare? How should that healthcare be delivered? Should everyone have access, or should there be different healthcare systems? And there's been a debate in our own society, right? What kind of, almost every, I want to say every, but maybe there's some holdouts. Almost every European country has a universal healthcare system. And the United States has never had that. And so, who is included? What does it take to be a member? Who gets delivered healthcare? It can be a huge factor in thinking about nations and who belongs and who is, and what is the responsibility of the nation to its citizens. Another few things we might think about, a lot of people, will compose a national anthem. May have heard one recently. Different kinds of music, which gets tagged as being national music. Different festivals, we'll talk about different kinds of festivals that get marked, especially almost every country celebrates its Day of Independence, some specific day upon which, at which time we believe that independence was achieved. So, it's not simply here. Again, you always have to ask, who is included, who is excluded? And that's in part because whenever you have a nation, I'll say almost all the time you have a nation, you're going to have ideas about who belongs in terms of gender, who is able to vote, who is able to own property, who is able or who is said to be able to lead that country. Like I said, we're going to be talking about gender on Thursday, specifically about gender in Latin America. But here's a little bit of a preview, because it's always, whenever you have the idea of, a national system, you might even say, what gender is the nation itself? Is it seen as a motherland, a fatherland, seen as something that is caring for or more warrior-like? And who is granted importance in that idea? So almost every time that a nation, maybe every time you have an idea about a nation, it's always going to be a gendered idea. And that's not to say it's not going to change over time. Of course it does. But those ideas run deep and are linked to the ideas of nationhood. And it is also almost always going to be tied to ideas about race, or especially in the Americas. This has been a huge issue, or a huge a running theme, you might say. And as several of you pointed out in your web posts, which are very good this week, Monday's posts are very good. There's an interesting issue here, is that most of the elites, the people on the top of the system in Latin American and Caribbean countries, really wanted their countries to be whiter than they were. They were very interested in promoting ideas of being linked to Europe and being linked to whiteness. And this was, as we saw in the film a little bit, some of the people who were most helping out in the revolution, I would say especially some of the African-descended populations who were most helping out in the revolution, they were like, okay, good job, folks, we did it. Now go back to wherever you were. Now go and, do what you're going to do. And as Giselle put it in her post, a lot of the times what the Latin American, the elites wanted them to do is to keep working in the farms, keep working in the mines, and sort of maintain their social position. Well, the elites wanted to maintain their social position, and they wanted to keep the other people, the non-elites, if you would, out of the economic system. And so, in some ways, for many people in the Americas, probably especially those who were identified as indigenous people, things got often worse under independence because at least before they had some amount of protection from the Spanish crown. And we kind of see this in some of the films. You can even see it a little bit in the one we just watched, The Great Inca Rebellion. Remember that as he said, the historical documents are that it is the descendants of Pizarro, the descendants of the conquistador, who are trying to get money from the crown. And the crown brings up witnesses from the indigenous population, and they say, no, these guys didn't even fight that much in this siege. In fact, we're the ones that deserve some recompense here. And so for some people, it's complex in the same way that there are a lot of people in the United States who did better under the British than they did under the new government. For some people in Latin America, they had access to European courts and justice in a way that once the revolutions happened, once independence happened, they didn't have that access anymore, and they were more controlled by the local elites than they had been in the past. How did that make them feel, Brendan? What did they do about that? At least in Cuba.
Oh yeah, in Cuba, they wanted to be more like equal, and they wanted like every like non-white to be like lesser than like actual whites, and so they tried, but like all the whites were like, no, like this is like not ever gonna happen. Like if you are not white, then like you will not be as equal, and they thought of them like to be like lesser than them.
Yeah, so a lot of people, were not excited. They didn't want to go home after this. They didn't want to be in their own social order. They wanted the same rights as anyone else. But, so what you have in many of these countries, you have this very small elite, which is a minority of the population, that identifies as white, that identifies as sort of European or European descendant, and they want to keep control over what's going on economically, socially. They don't want things to be, they want independence, but they don't want it to be out of control. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit, or quite a bit more tomorrow, but I want to preface this in terms of kind of compare contrast with the United States, because I think sometimes we get confused here about things. In the United States, we often see that the white people have considered themselves to be the majority, right? And so they talk about the majority, and then the white people also talk about other people as minorities, right? So that's been kind of, for complicated reasons, this hasn't even been numerically true in the United States, but we keep kind of perpetuating it in various ways, partly by letting the Italians and the Irish into the white category. But that said, the prevailing ideology of the United States is we can expand, in some ways, the rights of other people because we have a white majority and the other people are in the minority. In many Latin American countries, the elite people who identified as white never felt like they were in the majority. They always felt like they were in the minority. And that if you expanded even a tiny bit outside of there, you'd let in just a huge amount of non-white people. And part of it is demographic, as we talked about, and we'll talk about tomorrow. The slave trade brought many, many more enslaved Africans into Latin American countries than into the United States. Also, this was the place of the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire, and even though a lot of people did die, a lot of people remain. And so demographically, a white identifying Latin elite would have looked out over their country and said, we can't have a democracy here. We don't want to institute any reforms that will help anyone because we're trying to preserve our control, not as a majority, but as a minority. And so as the United States itself shifts from being sort of majority, minority, and people have talked about this shift, you'll notice that people do different things to try and stay in power than they may have before. But this has been kind of a common theme in Latin American countries. Now, I want to mention that sometimes some of the Latin American elites that identify as white, when they come to the United States, the people in the United States look at them and say, hey man, you're Latino, you're not white, right? And we get confused. So recently we had an election, you may have noticed, and people get all excited and they're like, oh my gosh, look at all these Latinos who voted for Trump. What does that mean? And I'm like, I don't know. Look at Latin America and you'll find a huge number, well, at least a decent sized number of people who have voted very conservatively, voted for authoritarian governments, and identified as white and in the colonizing projects. This is not a surprise if you understand what was going on in many of these Latin American countries and how people might identify when they come to the United States. Because I don't want to give too much away about tomorrow's class. So, what do you do if you want to preserve control? A number of Latin American countries tried to encourage people immigrating from Europe. They thought that by doing that, they could make their countries look whiter, more like the United States. Argentina is probably the most famous example, encouraged a lot of Italians to come to Argentina. The idea to make sure you had a whitened population. The other idea is, a lot of countries in Latin America, again, the elites looked out over their populations and they wondered, well, what's going to happen here? And the idea was that as people mixed together, what is called a process of mestizaje, mixing together, the idea was that that would whiten the population. And that had to do with specific ideas about race and how the elites thought that, you could kind of raise people up to their own level. And so the idea was that as people biologically mixed, that would be a whitening process of the country. So that was another thing that people thought about. That said, and again, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, but I just want to bring it up in the context of the nation. There were some people, intellectuals and elites in Latin America, who, unlike the very racist eugenics movement in the United States, celebrated the idea of mixing. And they celebrated the idea that the mixing of various populations would lead not to a degeneration, which is what many people in the United States believed, that it was going to degenerate, but that it would lead to this, this idea of hybrid vigor. You may have heard of that if you're a botanist type, the idea that if you mix two things together, the hybrid is better. And so in some ways this echoes, if you remember back to the very first song we listened to, Somos Más Americanos, the idea that if we mix these things together, mix indigenous, with Europeans, with Africans. We're going to get this, this new person who's going to be even better than the degenerate purity. These are all, as we'll see in the next class, these are all socially constructed. There's no biological basis for believing either of those things. But some people in Latin America did get this idea that we could have a new nation built on mixing and mixed people. So I put that ... because it's coming up tomorrow. All right, a few other things from this chapter. The idea of how we write history. History that has traditionally been written from an elite perspective, and those who would kind of try to get a perspective more from below. So in my idea, when I think about Latin American history and history in general, I think a lot has already been said, or there's lots that has been written about how, I don't know, the elites of Costa Rica were able to make a successful nation. They were able to do it and have these schools and a healthcare system, and yay, Costa Rica. So, a lot has been written about that. There's also been quite a bit written on places where the elites didn't really do the nation building and it failed, either because they didn't have enough money and resources to do it, or because they were more interested in their own class interests and preserving their wealth. They didn't want to have any taxation system or anything that would do that. Or they might have identified more with their region than they did with their country. And so there are various Latin American countries, Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador actually is very regional. You have people that identify more as being from the Quito area or from the Cuenca area, from the coast, from Guayaquil, maybe even identify more with that than with being from the same country. So there's been a lot about, did the elite have an idea of nation? And there's some, but not as much as, I think we should have more of this, I guess I would say. More on, are there notions or ideas of being a nation that were part of the popular class or part of the people who might be considered working class or excluded from the nation? And there's some interesting examples of people who seem to have allied together. For example, the people who were fighting off the French in Mexico, who seem to have had some ideas of belonging to a nation, but it wasn't an elite idea. So I know, Gabe out there, you were looking at Florencia Malin, who was kind of, remember, she's a little bit of a famous historian of Latin America. I remember reading her back when I was in college, and she was a hero of mine. Unfortunately, there's not that much about her, as Gabe found out. But, someone who's looked at this idea of nations from below and what those ideas are. And then there's this really interesting thing that happens where Santabria finally tells us the meaning of Cinco de Mayo. See if I can call in one of my remote people. Alexandra, did you find anything out about Cinco de Mayo? Might not work. Doesn't seem to. All right, well, if you read Alexandra's comment, you'll find out. Maybe I can ask somebody else. Oh, Louis, what do you find out about Cinco de Mayo? It is not Mexican. Yeah, the day that we think of as most Mexican here in the United States it has something to do with Mexico, which is that it was made by Latinos in Oregon and California in support of what was going on in Mexico. So it is an authentic kind of thing, really not celebrated in Mexico. And now it's been taken over like various other days, like say St. Patrick's Day, by the commercialized crowd and the interest. But a really fascinating idea, which again leads us to the idea of, hey, people seem to have a popular notion of defending their country and national sovereignty, which is not coming from necessarily the elite or from above. Of course, whenever you talk about history from below, then you have to bring up the people's history of the United States and various people who have tried to figure out what was going on among the non-elites. What's happened, Lydia, to those people over time?
The people who were trying to do, like, study them from that perspective.
Yeah, like if I say Howard Zinn, what do you say back?
Said that they were Marxists.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The last time I tried to quote something from Howard Zinn, they were like, ah, that's not a historian. He's just a... So, you know, in the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of the people who are trying to do this history from below have been tagged as being ideologues and Marxists and all this thing. So somehow it's kind of like what we said about not having shared facts anymore. We had a wonderful historical project. You may have heard about it from the New York Times called the 1619, I think that's right, project, which is about, you know, the influence of slavery and how important that has been in the American story. And then just before leaving, the Trump administration put out, I think it was called the 1776 Project, which basically said everything these historians said is stupid. Fortunately, that you can only read that in various places. But the whole notion of what history you should be able to teach, I think Howard Zinn's books have been banned in certain states from being taught in school. Hopefully we'll be entering an era of more shared facts soon. Can't wait. All right. So a couple other things that came up in your questions and made me research some things because I wanted to know about them. So there's a kind of, I would say there's this kind of standard script when we think about independence in Latin America. People know about, maybe you don't, but a lot of people know about the Mexican Revolution. And so how Mexico gets independence because Mexico is next to the United States, and, you know, not long after the United States, it has its own revolution and achieves independence. And then people sometimes think about Simón Bolívar, who is known especially in the northern areas of South America, as the liberator. Simón Bolívar in almost every little town has a Simón Bolívar on horseback or striding through. Yeah, it's everywhere. In fact, the whole name Bolivia is derived from Simón Bolívar. He was able for a time not just to establish independent. He had what is now Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador all formed a big country called was called Gran Colombia. And so the idea was that it was going to sort of rival the United States, but then they split into these different countries and factions. And then I don't know so much about this person, but if you lived in Argentina or Chile or Uruguay, Jose de San Martin is seen as kind of a liberator of the southern cone countries, they're called. Again, so these are all kind of, like I said, they're standard to us. We learn about them because they've all been kind of heroized or made into textbooks and occur in places that have been very successful at promoting a national history. So that's the standard. And then there's some things that we don't know so much about, that haven't been so successful or have a very different perspective on being independent. So as we learned in the last class, and we learned in the first part of Santabria, the first independent country in the Americas, which we usually don't know about, was Haiti, the very first and the only successful revolution of enslaved peoples. A lot of people, even I didn't realize this about Simón Bolívar. He had tried some revolutionary stuff, and then he had to flee. He first fled to Jamaica, where they tried to assassinate him. And so he fled to Haiti, where he got aid and refuge. And he actually developed some friendships there. He stayed there for a little bit, and they gave him resources to sort of take up the revolutionary fight again, under the condition that in the lands that he won back from Spain, he would abolish slavery. And oddly enough, he went and he sort of kept his word on that. And so that's seen as one of his big legacies. Is they didn't have a huge slave population there, but that was one of the things that he tried to do, in part because he had been aided by people from Haiti. Again, not something everybody knows about. Also, there's some places in the Americas, we've talked about this in the first or second class, that are still part of France. French Guiana, the only place in South America which is still part of a European country. So French Guiana actually belongs to France. Also, the Guadeloupe, which is a whole sort of an archipelago of little islands in the Caribbean, and Martinique, another island in the Caribbean. Interestingly, all of these places use the euro as their official currency. So there they are, using the euro right there. And technically are part of the European Union. Whoa, freaky. That's why I have these exclamation points. Didn't know that. Another place that has never been independent. It was transferred to the United States after the war with Spain. Is Puerto Rico. Never been independent. As you may know, hopefully you know, Puerto Ricans are US citizens. Travel freely, have US passports, all that stuff. It's always, you just never know. Puerto Rico is a place that you never know if it's going to be considered by the outside world to be part of the United States or its own thing. I always wondered why it got its own contestant for Miss Universe. There'd be Miss Puerto Rico there, So sometimes they get their own thing, sometimes they're US citizens, but a lot of people are like, what are all these Puerto Ricans doing? Well, hey, they're US citizens. I think Brennan wanted to know what the most recent country was that achieved independence. The one that I found the most recent, I think, is Belize, what was once known as British Honduras, which is close to Guatemala. This is a process that started in the 1960s when it achieved a certain amount of autonomy. I think it did then, I read, got sort of formal independence around the 1970s, but because of a border dispute with Guatemala, something that needed to be resolved, then it didn't get, it couldn't be pronounced as fully independent until around 1980. Actually, Lydia, you went to Belize once, true? Do they really speak English there?
Yeah, and you could pay with stuff with American dollars, like anywhere.
Oh, okay.
Like they had their own coins, but you could use American dollars, and like they don't. A lot of them did speak English, but they also speak like a weird version of Spanish.
Right. Yeah. So there's English is an official language. About half of the population apparently does speak Spanish, at least as a second language. So it might be a version of Spanish. And then there's actually also a Creole language there, which is probably, I'm going to guess, a blend of English, Spanish, indigenous languages. So it's perhaps it's a very interesting place. And like I said, some people are like, that's not Latin America. And then there's Brazil. And, I have to say that we could run a whole course on Brazil. And if you get to take a course with Professor Nishida, who actually is someone who did her research in Brazil, She has sometimes taught an upper level course on Brazil, teaches on gender and power in Latin America. The most relevant course I could find for you in the spring is her Modern Latin America course, which you'll probably get a lot about Brazil because of her research interests. Brazil is, again, it's got its own story. So technically, Brazil became independent in 1822, but really not in some ways, because what had happened is Napoleon was taking over various parts of Europe and invaded Portugal, and the Portuguese monarchy left Portugal and relocated into Sao Paulo, Brazil. So they were kind of under the relocated Portuguese monarchy. And then, so technically they were technically independent in 1822, but then they weren't really independent until about 60 years after that. So, it's its own very interesting story. Again, if you're interested in the history of these things, we'll be talking some about that, but I would really recommend Professor Nishida's classes for digging into some of these historical things. Okay. So I want to talk about one more thing that is something that Santabria doesn't talk about, but from time to time is the best way to build your country, the best way to instill a sense of countryness, nationness in the people. What is it? It's the best way. What's a good way to make people feel country, like they belong to their country?
I mean, like going to war and help the U.S.
Going to war, yeah. Being in the military in general, bringing people. So in various countries, and I would include the United States in this, the military is a way in which you bring together people from different regions and you have them, train together, fight alongside one another. Oftentimes, many countries have had a compulsory military service where after you graduate or you turn 18, everybody, well, often all the males, some countries, everybody, but oftentimes at least the young men, then they would, you bring the Southerners up to the north and you send the Northerners down to the south and you mix them all together and you give them this common sense of being in the same country. And, it also helps sometimes if you're fighting off somebody, it's like, okay, I mentioned the border dispute between Belize and Guatemala. You not only do you bring in your people, but you get all excited about, this has happened time and time again in various Latin American countries where you gin up a hatred or a something about the people next door, and then you have all of this national unity. So it can be a huge nation building force. It can also backfire. And I want to end our class with a song this time. As I'm mixing things up, this is from one of my favorite artists in Latin America. It's a group that has its origins in Argentina, and this song comes to us from 1974. It's called Botas Locas, which is roughly translated as Mad Boots. And it's a story of, unfortunately, I don't have this time, I don't have a full English translation, but it's the story of, in Argentina, there was a military dictatorship and everybody had to join the military for, 1 or 2 years. And it's about young people who are sort of rebelling, young men who are rebelling against this. And it kind of it's a paradox in some ways, because sometimes this is great for nation building, but sometimes it can really piss people off and they kind of rebel against the whole idea of being in the military. And you can see in some of the imagery, this is going to be on YouTube, you can see in some of the imagery that not only they end up rebelling against the idea of the nation and against the idea of the military, but they start doing some things that we might consider gender fluid stuff, as opposed to all the things. The imagery comes to us not from an official video, but from a fan who kind of composed these images. And hopefully that will give you, if you're not a Spanish speaker, it will give you a sense of what they are fighting against or angry about. So one of the best lines in here, again, roughly translated by me, they all, they tell us, they make us love our country, but if they, in reference to the military, if those guys are the country, I'll be a foreigner. I'm a foreigner. These guys don't speak for me. So let's see, what do I want to do? What I need to do, my most successful thing is to stop sharing and stop recording.